The pole's still here, you know. That's the first thing I tell people when they ask me about the old days. They expect me to start somewhere grand, I suppose, with the city, or the fog, or some speech about light and darkness. But the first thing I always say is, the pole's still here. It's leaning against the back wall of my daughter's garden shed, behind the clay pots and the rusted watering can she never uses. 12 feet of solid ash wood, worn smooth at the grip from 41 years of my right hand closing around it every single evening. The brass fitting at the top, the one that held the small copper wick trimmer and the pilot flame cup, is gone now. Corroded off sometime in the 90s, she told me, but the wood itself is still sound. You can knock on it and it answers you back with a low, solid thunk. Good ash does that. It doesn't hollow out. I kept it because it was mine. Every lamplighter had his own pole, and you didn't share it, and you didn't lend it, and you didn't leave it behind at the end of a shift. It was the one tool that was entirely personal. The ladders were shared. The oil canisters were shared. The spare mantles and the cotton waste and the little tin of tallow for the hinge pins. All of that came from the depot. But the pole was yours. You chose the length that suited your reach. You balanced it in your hand until the weight felt right, and then you took it home with you every night, the same way a carpenter takes his favourite chisel. Mine came from a workshop in Salford. The man who made them was called Enoch Briggs, and he made lamplighter poles as a sideline to his main business, which was tool handles, adze handles, hatchet handles, that sort of thing. He had a good eye for ash. He'd tap the billets before he bought them, same as I described, listening for that particular density that meant the grain was tight and the wood had dried properly. A wet pole would warp on you within a season, and a warped pole meant you couldn't get the flame cup to sit flush against the lamp's ignition nipple, and then you'd be standing in the street jabbing at the thing while the gas hissed out into the cold air, and your supervisor stood at the end of the road with his clipboard and his bad temper. I bought my pole from Enoch Briggs in the autumn of 1951. I was 19 years old, and I had just been taken on as a junior lighter with the Manchester Corporation Gas Department, which by that point had been absorbed into the North Western Gas Board, following nationalisation. Though everyone still called it the corporation, the way people do when a name has been in a place long enough to feel like part of the street itself, my supervisor was a man named Gerald Howarth, who had been lighting lamps since 1927, and who regarded the nationalisation of the gas industry with the same quiet, resigned suspicion that he regarded most things that arrived after 1940. He wasn't unkind, he was simply precise. He believed that imprecision was the enemy of a well-lit street, and he communicated this belief not through speeches, but through the way he stood and watched you work, arms folded, saying nothing, which was considerably more effective. Gerald was the one who told me to go to Enoch Briggs for my pole. He told me to tell Enoch that I had a long reach. I was 6 feet and a half inch at 19, which was tall for the time, and that I wanted the pole balanced toward the lower end rather than the upper, because a top-heavy pole makes your wrist ache on a long circuit. Enoch nodded when I told him this, as though it confirmed something he already knew, and he went into the back and came out with 3 different poles for me to hold. I chose the second one. It felt like an extension of my arm rather than a thing I was carrying. I want to tell you about the circuits, because that's really where the life of a lamplighter actually lived. Not in the depot, not in the conversations with the foreman, not in the paperwork. Though there was paperwork, there always was, but in the circuits. A circuit was your assigned route, your list of lamps. In a city like Manchester in the early 1950s, there were still thousands of gas lamps operating, particularly in the older residential streets and the back lanes behind the terraced rows. The conversion to electric street lighting had been going on since the 1920s, but it moved in patches, district by district, and the gas lamps held on in certain neighbourhoods for a long time after the electric standards had gone up on the main roads. The gas lamps were cheaper to maintain in established areas where the infrastructure was already in the ground, and there was a constituency of people, councillors, residents, certain engineers at the corporation, who were genuinely fond of them and found reasons to delay their removal. I was glad of that. It kept me employed. My first circuit was in the Ardwick and Chawton on Medlock area, which was a mixed district in those years. Some streets still quite respectable, some already beginning the long slide into the kind of neglect that would eventually bring the bulldozers in the 60s. The circuit covered 114 lamps. I know that number precisely because I wrote it on the inside cover of the small notebook I carried in my breast pocket. along with the lamp numbers and a hand-drawn map that Gerald had corrected in 3 places with a red pencil stub. 114 lamps. On a clear autumn evening, I could complete the lighting round in just under 2 hours. On a wet, cold night in February, when the wind was coming down from the north and the lamp housings were damp and the gas pressure was running low because half the city was cooking their suppers simultaneously, it could take 3 hours or more. The gas pressure issue is worth explaining because it was one of the great practical frustrations of the job, and also one of the things that most people who romanticize lamplighting never think about. Gas lamps operated on the pressure of the gas supply coming through the underground mains. In the early evening, when domestic demand was highest, people coming home, lighting their stoves, running their boilers, the pressure in the residential supply lines dropped. This meant that when you opened the gas cock on a street lamp and applied your flame, the gas came through weakly, and the mantle, the fragile mesh sock that glowed when the gas burned through it, would light, but dimly, and might gutter and go out if you didn't hold the flame steady and wait for the pressure to stabilize. You learned to read the pressure by sound. A strong, even hiss when you cracked the cock meant good pressure, and the lamp would light cleanly. A thin, wavering hiss meant you were fighting the demand curve, and you needed patience. The mantles themselves were a constant preoccupation. By the time I started, most of the lamps on my circuit used the inverted incandescent mantle, which had been the standard since the late Victorian period. The mantle was invented by Karl Auer von Welsbach, an Austrian chemist, in 1885, and it transformed gas lighting entirely. Before the mantle, gas lamps burned with an open flame, a fishtail burner or an argon burner, which gave a yellow flickering light that was useful but not brilliant. The mantle changed that. It was a small mesh sock, originally made from cotton thread impregnated with a mixture of thorium oxide and cerium oxide, though by my time, thorium had largely been replaced with other compounds for safety reasons, and when you burned it for the first time, the cotton thread incinerated and left behind an incredibly fragile lattice of metal oxide that glowed with a bright white light when gas burned through it. A good mantle could last for weeks. A mantle that had been knocked or vibrated by a passing lorry, by a careless hand, by a stone thrown by a child, would crumble at a touch. Replacing a mantle was a delicate operation. You opened the lamp housing. Most of the lamps on my circuit had a hinged glass panel on 1 or 2 sides, secured with a small thumb-turn latch, and you reached in and carefully unscrewed the old mantle from its burner tip. If the mantle was intact but simply exhausted, it came off in one piece, papery and grey. If it had been damaged, it came off in fragments that drifted down like grey snow and got into your eyes if you weren't careful. You threaded the new mantle. They came folded flat in small cardboard boxes, 6 to a box, onto the burner tip, tied the drawstring if it had one, and then you had to burn it off before you could light the lamp properly. You held your flame to the bottom of the new mantle for a few seconds, just long enough to ignite the cotton, and then you stepped back and watched it burn away with a brief, bright flare that left the oxide lattice glowing faintly in the dark. Then you closed the housing, opened the gas cock, applied the pilot flame from the cup at the top of your pole, and if everything had gone right, the lamp came on with a clean, steady light. Gerald Howarth could replace a mantle in under 3 minutes. I never quite matched him, but by my second year, I was down to 4, which he acknowledged with a brief nod that I understood to be high praise. I want to stay with the circuit for a while, because I think it's the part of this work that is hardest to explain to someone who has never done it, and also the part that I find I miss most when I let myself think about it quietly in the evenings. The circuit was a relationship. That's the only word I have for it. You walked the same streets, in the same order, at the same time every evening, for years. You knew every lamp the way you know the rooms of your own house, not by thinking about them, but by the particular quality of your attention when you were near them. Lamp 47 on my first circuit, on the corner of Upper Brook Street, and a narrow passage that ran behind a row of solicitors' offices. That lamp had a stiff gas cock. You had to apply a half-turn more pressure than felt natural, and you had to hold it there for a count of 3 before the gas came through. If you didn't know that, you'd light it and walk away and it would go out behind you, and you'd have to come back. I knew it. I'd known it since my 3rd week on the circuit, when Gerald pointed it out to me without breaking stride, just a quiet word as we passed. That one's stiff. Remember? I remembered. Lamp 62 was at the end of a cul-de-sac called Hewitt's Court. which was a small cluster of back-to-back houses that had somehow survived the various improvement schemes of the preceding decades. The lamp there was an older model, a converted oil lamp that had been fitted with a gas supply sometime in the 1890s, and which still had the original iron post with the acanthus leaf decoration at the capital that the Victorian foundries liked to put on their better street furniture. The glass on that lamp was slightly greenish, an old glass, and it gave the light a particular quality that I always noticed. Not unpleasant, just different. The people in Hewitt's Court knew me by name. Mrs. Caldwell, who lived in the end house and kept a tabby cat that sat in the window every evening, would sometimes have a cup of tea waiting on her step if the weather was cold. She'd hand it out through the door without coming out herself, and I'd drink it standing by the lamp, and we'd exchange a few words about the weather or the news, and then I'd hand the cup back and move on. That was a relationship too. Not a friendship exactly. We never met outside of those evening exchanges, but something real and steady that existed because I came to that lamp at the same time every evening, and she knew I would. This is one of the things that the history books don't quite capture when they write about lamplighters. They write about the technology, about the gas companies, about the economics of municipal lighting. They don't write very much about the fact that the lamplighter was a known figure in his streets. Not famous, not important in any official sense, but known. People set their clocks by us, which is literally true. Before reliable domestic clocks were common, and even after they were, people would look out of their windows when they heard the lamplighter coming and know that it was 4:30 or 5 o'clock, or whatever time the corporation had set for the lighting up hour that season. The lighting up hour changed with the seasons, of course. In December, it might be as early as 3:30 in the afternoon. In June, we didn't go out until 9 or later. The corporation published a lighting schedule, a printed card that we carried, and it was adjusted every 2 weeks throughout the year to track the changing length of the day. I still have one of those cards somewhere, printed on thin paper, the ink slightly smudged where it had been folded and unfolded too many times. My second circuit came in 1954, when Gerald Howarth retired, and I was moved to cover a larger area to the south, taking in parts of Moss Side and Rusholme. This was a longer circuit, 162 lamps, and it required me to use a bicycle for the first time. The corporation provided bicycles for the longer circuits, plain black roadsters with a bracket on the frame for the pole, and a canvas bag on the rear rack for the mantle boxes and the other supplies. Riding with the pole was something you had to learn. It stuck out behind the bicycle at an angle, and if you turned too sharply it would catch on things, and if you braked suddenly it would slide forward in the bracket, and you'd have a 12-foot ash pole swinging past your ear. I knocked a gatepost off its hinges in my first week on the bicycle. Gerald would have been quietly appalled. I nailed the post back myself the following morning and said nothing to anyone. The Moss Side and Rusholme circuit had a different character from the Ardwick one. The streets were wider in places, the lamps more spread out, and there were several long straight runs where you could get up a good pace on the bicycle and cover 4 or 5 lamps in quick succession. But there were also the back streets, the entries and the ginnels, the narrow passages between terraced rows where the bicycle was useless and you had to leave it leaning against the wall and proceed on foot, the pole over your shoulder. Those back entry lamps were always the most neglected. They were harder to reach for maintenance, harder to inspect, and they were the ones most likely to have broken glass, or a missing mantle, or a gas cock that had been turned off by someone who didn't know what they were doing, or did know, and had reasons of their own. I should tell you about the snuffing, because most people, when they think of lamplighters at all, think only of the lighting. The snuffing, the extinguishing of the lamps in the morning, was an equal part of the job and had its own character entirely. The morning round was quieter than the evening one. That's the simplest way to put it. You went out before dawn, typically, depending on the season, and you walked or cycled the circuit in reverse, extinguishing the lamps as the sky lightened. The tool for extinguishing was different from the lighting cup. On the top of the pole, opposite the flame cup, there was a small hook. Some poles had a brass hook. Mine had one I'd had fitted by a metalsmith on Deansgate, and you used this hook to reach up and turn the gas cock to the off position. On the older lamps, the cock was on the outside of the housing, accessible from below. On the newer models, you had to open the housing first. Either way, the technique was the same. Hook, turn, listen for the hiss to stop, move on. The morning round had a meditative quality that I've never found quite the right words for. The streets were almost empty. The milkman might be out. or a night shift worker making his way home. And you'd nod to each other in the grey pre-dawn light with the particular solidarity of people who are awake, while the rest of the world sleeps. The lamps themselves, seen in the growing daylight, look different from how they looked at night. At night, a gas lamp is a source of light, the centre of a small warm world. In the morning, extinguished, it's just an iron post with a glass box on top. Slightly dusty, slightly ordinary. I always found something peaceful in that transition. Watching a lamp go from glowing to dark as the sky behind it went from dark to pale grey to the particular thin blue of a winter morning. The lamp gives up its light just as the sky reclaims it. There's a rightness to that exchange that I appreciated without ever quite being able to articulate it to anyone who hadn't done the work. In winter, the morning round was cold in a way that settled into your bones by the second hour. You wore what you could. The corporation issued a heavy cotton overall, dark blue, with the gas board's initials on the breast pocket. But it wasn't really warm enough for February at 5 in the morning, and most of us wore our own coats underneath it and our own scarves and gloves. The gloves were a compromise. You needed bare fingers to feel the gas cock properly, to know when it had turned fully to the off position, and thick gloves made that difficult. I wore thin leather gloves with the fingertips cut away on the right hand, which was the working hand. My right hand was permanently reddened from the cold for most of the winter months. My wife used to warm it between both of hers when I came in, without being asked, the way you do things for someone you've lived with long enough to understand. I married in 1957. Her name was Dorothy, and she had grown up in Levenshulme, not far from the southern edge of my circuit, and she knew what a lamplighter's hours were before she agreed to marry one. She was practical about it. She kept her own schedule, which ran later than mine. She worked mornings at a draper's shop on Stockport Road, and we overlapped in the middle of the day, which suited us both well enough. We ate our main meal at 2 in the afternoon for most of our married life, which struck visitors as eccentric, but which felt entirely natural to us. I was out the door by 4 in winter, and she would have the fire banked up and a flask of tea made and waiting on the kitchen table, and I would take the flask with me and drink it standing at a lamp somewhere in the middle of the circuit, usually around 6 o'clock, when the streets were at their busiest and the lamps were at their most necessary. That flask, a green tartan pattern on the outside, a cork stopper, and a glass liner that she replaced twice over the years when I dropped it. I carried it in the canvas bag on the bicycle rack, wrapped in a piece of old blanket to keep it from rattling against the mantel boxes. The tea inside was always strong and always had too much sugar, which Dorothy insisted was necessary for working in the cold, and which I eventually stopped arguing about sometime in the early 1960s. I want to talk about the lamps themselves more carefully, because they were not all the same and the differences mattered. On my circuits over the years, I worked with several different generations of gas street lamp, and each had its own personality. The oldest lamps I encountered, the ones that dated from the mid-Victorian period, were large, elaborate things, mounted on tall fluted iron posts that had been cast in foundries in Birmingham or Sheffield. The lamp housings on these were octagonal or hexagonal, with multiple glass panels set in iron frames, and they burned with an open flame burner, a bat swing or fishtail type, that gave a warm, orange-yellow light. By the time I started in 1951, most of these open flame lamps had been converted to mantle burners, but the conversion was sometimes imperfect, and you could tell the old ones by the way the housing sat on the post, slightly too large for the burner assembly inside, the proportion slightly off, like a suit made for a bigger man. The more common lamp on my circuits was the standard corporation pattern from the 1920s and 1930s, a simpler, more functional design, with a cylindrical housing, a single door panel, and a straightforward inverted mantle burner. These were reliable lamps. They lit easily, they burned steadily, and the gas cock was well positioned for the pole hook. They didn't have the grandeur of the Victorian lamps, but they worked, and in this trade working was what mattered. Then there were the lanterns on the main roads, the newer electric standards that had gone up in the 30s and 40s, and these were not my concern at all. They belonged to a different department, different men, different skills. We sometimes passed each other's territory at the boundaries, and there was a civil enough relationship between the gaslighters and the electric maintenance men, though there was also a mild professional rivalry that expressed itself mostly in jokes. The electric men liked to say that their lamps came on by themselves and didn't need a man with a pole to nurse them along. The gas men liked to point out that when the electricity failed, which it did in those years with some regularity, the whole street went dark at once, while a gas lamp, being independent of the grid, stayed lit until someone physically turned it off. Both observations were true. Neither side conceded anything. The question of the automatic igniters is one I should address, because it comes up whenever I talk about this work. From the 1920s onward, there was a push by various gas companies to install automatic lighting systems in street lamps, mechanisms that would ignite the gas at a set time without requiring a lamplighter. Several systems were tried. The most common used a small pilot light that burned continuously at a very low level and which could be connected to the main gas supply by a time-controlled valve. When the valve opened at the preset lighting up hour, gas flowed to the mantle and the pilot light ignited it. These were called self-lighting lamps, or sometimes automatic lamps, and they were installed in various cities from the 1930s onward. Manchester had some of them, but not on my circuits for most of my career. The older lamp infrastructure in the residential streets didn't easily accommodate the automatic valve mechanisms, and the cost of retrofitting was difficult to justify when the lamps were already scheduled for eventual replacement by electric lighting. So we continued to light by hand, which suited me. I won't pretend otherwise. The automatic lamps meant fewer lamplighters, and I was aware of that arithmetic in a way that made me quietly grateful for every Victorian gas main that was too old to accept a time valve. There is something I want to tell you about the fog, because it was a real and significant part of the working environment in those years, and because it had a quality that is almost impossible to convey to someone who didn't experience it. The fogs of industrial Manchester in the late 1940s and early 1950s were not the romantic, gauzy mists of picture books. They were dense, sulphurous, yellow-brown affairs that smelled of coal smoke and damp stone and something chemical underneath that you couldn't quite identify. They came in the autumn and winter when the atmospheric conditions trapped the smoke from the city's chimneys close to the ground, and they could reduce visibility to a matter of yards. In a bad fog, you could not see the next lamp on your circuit from the one you were currently working on. You navigated by memory and by feel, by the number of steps between lamps, by the sound of the street, by the particular quality of the curb under your feet. In those conditions, the gas lamps were essential in a way that is hard to overstate. Not because they gave much light in a fog. The light was diffused and scattered by the water droplets and the particulates, and it didn't penetrate more than a few feet, but because they gave a point of reference, a warm, amber glow hanging in the murk, telling you where the corner was, where the crossing was, where the edge of the pavement ended and the road began. People navigated by the lamps in a heavy fog the way sailors navigate by buoys. You went from lamp to lamp, keeping them in sight, and as long as you could see the next lamp, you knew where you were. I lit my circuit in a bad fog one November evening in 1952. I was still on the Ardwick circuit then, still learning, and I remember the particular silence of it. The fog muffled everything. The traffic, the voices, the ordinary sounds of the city in the early evening. All of it reduced to a soft, indistinct murmur. And in that silence, the sound of my own footsteps on the pavement, and the small hiss of gas as I opened each cock, and the quiet pop of the mantle catching. These sounds were very clear and very close. It was not frightening exactly. It was more like being inside something, like the city had drawn a curtain around you, and you were working in a private, enclosed space that happened to be in the middle of a street. The Clean Air Act came in 1956, after the Great Smog of London in 1952 had killed several thousand people and made the issue impossible to ignore any longer. The Act restricted the burning of coal in domestic grates in designated smoke control areas, and it changed the atmosphere of the industrial cities measurably over the following decade. The fogs became less frequent, less dense, less suffocating. By the early 1960s, the worst of them were gone. I noticed the difference every winter. The air was cleaner, the visibility better, the lamps visible from further away. It was unambiguously a good thing. But I'll admit that there was something in those old foggy evenings, something in the particular quality of working in them, that I have never quite found elsewhere. In 1959, I was promoted to what the Northwestern Gas Board called a circuit supervisor, which meant that I was responsible for a group of 4 junior lighters and their circuits, in addition to maintaining my own reduced circuit of about 60 lamps. The supervisory role involved a good deal of the clipboard and pencil work that I had observed Gerald Howarth performing in my early years, and which I had privately resolved to carry out with less severity than he had. I'm not sure I entirely succeeded. The job required precision, and precision required a certain firmness, and firmness, in a man of my height and my particular quietness, could apparently read as severity to a 19-year-old with a new pole and a tendency to rush the morning round. The junior lighters I supervised over the years were a varied group. Some took to the work immediately, with the instinctive feel for the pole and the gas cock, and the particular patience that the job required. Others struggled with the routine of it, the repetition, the solitary nature of the evening circuits. One young man, his name was Raymond, and he came to us in 1961 from a family that had been in the trade for 2 generations, his grandfather having been a lighter in the 1890s. Raymond was one of the finest natural lamplighter's I ever saw. He had a touch with the mantles that was almost surgical. He could replace a mantle in under 3 minutes from the first week, which was faster than I had managed in my first year, and I told him so, because I believed in telling people when they were genuinely good at something. Raymond left the trade in 1963 when the section of Moss Side that contained most of his circuit was converted to electric lighting. He went to work for a building firm and seemed content enough. We had a drink together on his last evening in a pub on Wilmslow Road, and he said something that has stayed with me. He said, "I'll miss knowing which lamps are mine." I understood exactly what he meant. The ownership, not legal ownership, but the deep practical familiarity of your own circuit, was one of the real satisfactions of the work. When a lamp on your circuit was working well, you felt a quiet pride in it. When one was giving trouble, you felt a personal responsibility. The lamps were yours in a way that had nothing to do with property and everything to do with attention. The conversions accelerated through the 1960s. It was not a sudden thing. It never is in a large city, with thousands of individual lamps and miles of infrastructure and the various committees and departments that have to agree on everything before anything happens. It was gradual, street by street, district by district. One evening, a section of your circuit would be there, the familiar lamps in their familiar order. A few months later, the corporation would come through with their lorry and their tools, and the gas lamps would come down, and the new electric standards would go up, and your circuit would be shorter by 10 or 15 lamps, and you'd adjust your map and your notebook and your timing, and you'd carry on. I watched it happen without bitterness, or at least I tried to. The electric lighting was brighter. That was simply true. The sodium vapor lamps that went up in the 60s gave a strong yellow-white light that illuminated the street much more thoroughly than the gas mantles had. You could read a newspaper under a sodium lamp from a considerable distance. The gas lamps had given a softer, warmer light, a pool of amber rather than a flood of yellow, and there were people who mourned that quality, who said the streets looked harsher under the electric lights, colder. I heard that complaint from residents many times over the years, but I also heard from the same residents that they felt safer, that the darker corners were gone, that they could see further and more clearly. Both things were true. The streets were brighter and they were colder, and whether that was an improvement depended on what you valued. What I valued, if I'm honest, was the work itself, the ritual of it, the particular daily relationship with a set of lamps in a set of streets, the accumulated knowledge of 100 small mechanical personalities, the pole in my hand and the flask in the bag, and the sound of my footsteps in the early morning. Those things didn't depend on the gas lamps being superior to the electric ones. They depended on the gas lamps existing, and on someone being needed to tend them. When the lamps went, the work went with them, and that was that. By 1970, my circuit had been reduced to 38 lamps, all of them in a small cluster of streets in Rushomy that had somehow remained on the gas supply, partly because the roads were narrow, and the underground electric cabling would have required expensive resurfacing work, and partly, I suspected, because there was a particular councillor who lived in one of those streets and who had a sentimental attachment to the lamp outside his house. I never confirmed this theory, but I noticed that the lamp outside Councillor Whitfield's house was always one of the last to be scheduled for removal on any list I saw, and I thought about it sometimes on my morning rounds. Those 38 lamps were a strange circuit to work. Too small to require a bicycle, too familiar to require much thought. I could have lit them with my eyes closed, and there were mornings when I came very close to doing so. walking the route in the grey pre-dawn on pure muscle memory. The pole balanced in my right hand, the gas cocks turning under the hook with a mechanical ease that required no conscious attention. In those moments, the mind was free to wander, and it wandered, as minds do, through the accumulated territory of the years. I thought about Gerald Howarth sometimes, on those mornings. He had died in 1965, quietly, at home, which was the right way for a man like him to go. I thought about Raymond and his gift for mantles. I thought about Mrs. Caldwell and her tabby cat and her cups of tea on the step in Hewitt's Court, and whether the electric lamp that had replaced the old green glass lantern on that corner was giving her good light or merely bright light, and whether she noticed the difference. I thought about the tools, the pole, the hook, the flame cup, the small copper wick trimmer that you used on the oil lamps. There were still a few oil lamps in very remote locations in those years, relics of a pre-gas era that had never been connected to the mains. The canvas bag, the mantle boxes with their 6 folded mantles each, the flask, the particular smell of the canvas bag after a few years of use, a mixture of oil and metal, and the faint sweetness of the gas that clung to your clothes and your hands, no matter how carefully you worked. The gas itself had a smell, of course. The natural gas that came through the mains in those years was coal gas, produced by heating coal in a retort, a process that had been the basis of the gas industry since the early 19th century, since William Murdoch had lit his house in Redruth with coal gas in 1792 and changed the nature of artificial light forever. Coal gas had a distinctive smell, sulphurous, slightly sweet, with an edge that caught at the back of your throat if you were near a leak. You learned to smell it the way a baker learns to smell bread, not consciously, but as a constant background awareness, a part of the sensory furniture of the job. A lamp that smelled strongly of gas when you approached it, before you'd opened the cock, meant a leak somewhere in the supply line or the lamp housing, and that meant you didn't light it. You marked it in your notebook with a red pencil cross and reported it to the depot for the gas fitters to attend to. I marked perhaps 3 or 4 lamps a year for gas fitter attention over my career. A few were serious enough that the street had to be cordoned while the fitters worked. Most were minor: a perished seal, a worn cock washer, a hairline crack in a supply pipe. The fitters were a separate trade entirely, and they regarded the lamplighters with a professional respect that was returned in kind. They fixed the infrastructure. We operated it. It was a sensible division. The coal gas era ended in the late 1960s and early 1970s, when the national network converted from coal gas to natural gas. This was a massive undertaking. Every appliance in the country that used gas had to be converted or replaced, and the composition of the gas itself changed, which affected the burner pressures and the flame characteristics. For the remaining gas street lamps, this meant adjustments to the burner jets and the gas cocks to accommodate the different pressure and calorific value of natural gas. A team of fitters went through my remaining 38 lamps in the spring of 1971 and made the necessary adjustments, and after that the lamps burned with a slightly different quality of light, a little brighter, a little bluer at the edge of the flame, and the smell, when you opened a cock, was different too. Natural gas has a fainter smell than coal gas, and the mercaptan that is added to it as a warning agent, because natural gas is odourless in its raw state, has a different character, sharper, more chemical, less of that old sweetish quality that I had associated with the gas mains for 20 years. I noticed the change and adapted to it, as you do. The work was the same, the pole was the same, the circuits, reduced as they were, had the same character. The difference was in the background details, the sensory texture of the job, and those details mattered to me in a way that was private and difficult to explain. Dorothy came out with me one evening, in the summer of 1972. This was unusual. She had never walked my circuit with me before, not in 15 years of marriage, though she had heard me describe it often enough. I'm not sure what prompted it. She said she wanted to see what I actually did, which I took to mean that she had been thinking about the fact that the work was ending, that the lamps were going, that there would come an evening when I would walk the last circuit and come home and not go out the next day, and she wanted to have seen it before that happened. We went out at 8:30, which was the lighting up hour for mid-July. The evenings were long, and the sky was still pale at that hour, the lamps more decorative than necessary in the lingering light. Dorothy wore her good coat, which I thought was slightly formal for the occasion but didn't say. I carried the pole over my shoulder and she walked beside me, and I showed her the circuit. I showed her how the pole worked, the flame cup at the top, the small reservoir of naphtha that fed the pilot flame, the hook on the opposite end. I showed her how you reached up and opened the gas cock with the hook, and then brought the flame cup up to the ignition nipple just below the mantle, and held it there while the gas caught. She watched closely and said nothing for several lamps, and then she said, "It's more precise than I imagined," which was exactly right. People imagine it as a simple casual gesture, a man with a stick touching a flame to a lamp, but the precision required, the particular angle of approach, the exact moment to withdraw the flame cup before the mantle flared too hot, the feel of the gas cock turning to the correct position, all of that was skill, accumulated over years, expressed in a series of movements that looked casual only because they were practiced. We walked the whole circuit that evening. It took us just under an hour and a half because we stopped more than I normally would, and I explained things, and Dorothy asked questions that were sensible and practical. She asked about the mantles, about the pressure, about the automatic igniters and why they hadn't been fitted to these lamps. She asked about the oldest lamp on the circuit, which was the one on the corner of Dickinson Road and a small side street, a lamp that dated from around 1880 and still had its original Victorian post with the fluted column and the acanthus capital, though the housing had been replaced at some point with a more modern unit that sat slightly awkwardly on the old post. She asked if I had a favourite lamp. I told her about the lamp in Hewitt's Court, though Hewitt's Court was not on this circuit. It had been on my first one, in Ardwick, and the lamp there had been removed in 1961. I told her about Mrs. Caldwell and the tea and the tabby cat. Dorothy listened and then said, "You should have told me about that at the time." I said I thought I had. She said I hadn't. We walked on in the warm evening, and I think we were both thinking about the same thing, which was how many evenings there had been, how many circuits, how many small particular moments that had seemed unremarkable at the time and which were now, in the light of their ending, becoming something else. The last gas lamp on my circuit was extinguished for the final time in March of 1974. I know the date exactly, the 14th of March, a Thursday, a cold morning with a clear sky and a hard frost on the pavements. The lamp was on Dickinson Road, the old Victorian one with the mismatched housing, and it was the last gas street lamp in that part of Manchester. The corporation had arranged for a small ceremony of sorts, which is to say that a man from the press office came with a photographer, and a local councillor came in a good overcoat, and they stood around while I extinguished the lamp for the last time. I used my pole. I reached up with the hook and turned the gas cock to the off position, and the lamp went dark, and the hiss of gas faded to silence. The photographer took several pictures. The councillor shook my hand and said something about the end of an era, which is what people say in those situations because there is nothing more precise to say. The press office man wrote something in his notebook, and then they left, and I was standing on Dickinson Road with my pole in my hand and the extinguished lamp above me, and the morning was very quiet and very cold, and the sky was the particular pale blue of a March dawn, and I stood there for perhaps 2 minutes before I walked back to where I'd left my bicycle. I kept the pole. Obviously, I kept the pole. The gas board offered me a position in the depot, administrative work, stores management, that sort of thing. I did it for 3 years until 1977, and it was not unpleasant, but it was not the same thing. I sat at a desk and I processed paperwork, and I occasionally went out to inspect a piece of infrastructure, and the work was useful and the people were decent, and none of it had the particular quality of the circuit. None of it had the pole in my hand and the sound of the gas cock and the mantle catching in the dark. I retired in 1977 at 45, which was younger than most. Dorothy and I moved to a smaller house in Didsbury, which had a garden, and I grew vegetables, which I found I was reasonably good at and which had some of the same qualities as the lamplighting, the daily routine, the practical attention, the accumulated knowledge of a particular patch of ground. Not the same, but something. The pole came with us to Didsbury, and then to the house in Heaton, Mersey where we lived after Dorothy's mother died, and left us a little money and we could afford something with more room. And then, after Dorothy died in 2003, quietly at home, which was the right way for her. The pole came with me to the flat in Stockport where I lived for a while, and then to my daughter's house in Bramhall, where I have been for the past several years, and where the pole now lives in the garden shed behind the clay pots and the watering can. My daughter's name is Susan, and she is 52 years old, and she is patient with me in the way that children are patient with old parents, which is to say that she is genuinely kind but also occasionally exasperated, and she expresses neither feeling very directly. She has asked me several times what she should do with the pole, and I have told her each time to keep it, and she has kept it without entirely understanding why. I think she will keep it after I am gone, for a while at least, because she is a person who understands that things can matter without being valuable, which is a form of understanding that not everyone arrives at. The lamp on the corner of her street is an electric one, a modern LED fitting on a concrete column, very bright, very efficient, burning from dusk to dawn on a photocell that requires no human attention. It is a good lamp. It lights the street well. I notice it sometimes when I am sitting by the window in the evening, which I do more than I used to, and it does its job without complaint or ceremony. But I notice other things too when I am sitting by that window. I notice the quality of the light at the edge of its pool, the way it falls off sharply into darkness, rather than fading gradually the way a gas lamp's light faded. I notice the colour of it, the cool blue-white of the LED, rather than the warm amber of the mantle. I notice that no one comes to tend it, that it simply comes on and goes off according to its own internal logic, without reference to any human hand or any particular knowledge of the street. These are not complaints, they are observations. The street is well lit, and the people on it can see where they are going, which was always the point. The technology has improved, as technology does, and the improvement is real and measurable and good. I know this. But I also know what it felt like to walk a circuit on a winter evening with a pole over my shoulder and a flask of sweet tea in the bag, and to know every lamp by its particular character, and to be known by the people in the streets as the man who came at the same time every evening and made the lamps come on. I know what it felt like to stand in Hewitt's Court in the cold and drink a cup of tea handed out through a door by a woman I never met in any other context, and to feel, in that small exchange, that the work I was doing was connected to the life of the street in a way that was real and daily and mutual. I know what it felt like to replace a mantle in the dark with cold fingers, and to step back and watch the new mantle flare as the cotton burned away, and then to open the gas cock and apply the flame and have the lamp come on clean and bright in the winter dark. The small satisfaction of that, the particular rightness of a lamp working well. I know what it felt like to extinguish the last lamp on a cold March morning, and to stand on the pavement with the pole in my hand and the silence around me and the pale blue sky above, and to know that the work was done and would not begin again. These things are not nothing. I am not sure what they are exactly, but they are not nothing. The pole is still here. You can knock on it, and it answers you back with a low, solid thunk. Good ash does that. It doesn't hollow out. I've been sitting here long enough that the tea has gone cold, which Dorothy would have said was my own fault for talking too much. She would have been right. She usually was. There's a lamp outside the window, as I said, the LED one on the concrete column. It came on about an hour ago, when the sky began to darken, and it's been burning steadily since then, the way those lamps do, without variation, without the small fluctuations of pressure and flame that you got with a gas mantle, without the particular quality of light that changes slightly in the wind. It's a reliable lamp. I have no quarrel with it. This has been the last shift. If tonight was kind to you, if the stone was solid and the lamp was steady and the dark was the right kind of dark, there is a small button somewhere nearby. It will keep the door open for next time. Good night. Sleep well. The light is on.